What if the most prolific killer of the 20th century never wielded a knife or gun? Never stalked victims through dark alleys or broke into homes at midnight. Instead, it simply existed, in walls, in gasoline, in water pipes. Not Dahmer, not Bundy, not Gacy. This killer operated silently, invisibly, and on a scale that dwarfs any individual murderer in history. This was a quiet killer that nobody was watching. While families went about their daily lives, it infiltrated bloodstreams, altered brain chemistry, and potentially helped create an entire generation of violent offenders. The evidence suggests something disturbing. America's serial killer epidemic might have had an environmental cause that nobody suspected until decades later. The question has puzzled true crime enthusiasts for years. Where did all the serial killers go? Why don't we have household name predators anymore, like we did in the 70s and 80s? Theories abound. Some credit improved DNA technology. Others point to surveillance cameras and better policing. One person even blamed planetary alignments, complete with astrological charts attempting to correlate star positions with murder rates. But one theory kept surfacing repeatedly in discussions, forums, and comment sections. Lead poisoning. Not as some fringe conspiracy theory, but as a scientifically documented phenomenon that might explain why America's so-called golden age of serial killers coincided perfectly with widespread environmental lead contamination. What if Bundy, Gacy, Ramirez, and their contemporaries weren't just products of broken homes and twisted psychology? What if they were products of something in the literal air they breathed as children? The theory suggests that lead poisoning, particularly during critical early childhood development, played a significant role in shaping the violence that defined the 1970s and 1980s. Not just making people sick, but fundamentally rewiring their brains in ways that increased violent tendencies. It didn't just poison a generation, it potentially transformed their neurological development in ways that made violence more likely, impulse control weaker, and empathy harder to access. Before diving deeper, it's worth acknowledging this is a conversation about uncomfortable possibilities, about questioning assumptions we've held for decades about what creates violent criminals. These are dark questions, but they're questions worth exploring. Anyone who grew up in the 90s remembers the endless parade of true crime programming: American Justice, Cold Case Files, America's Most Wanted. It felt like the country was producing a new monster every few months. The Zodiac, the Night Stalker, BTK. These weren't just criminals. They became cultural figures, their crimes analyzed endlessly, their pathologies debated by experts and amateurs alike. For decades, we explained these killers through familiar narratives. Abusive childhoods, sexual repression, violent pornography, Vietnam War trauma. Every generation selected its preferred explanation for why certain individuals became predators. But none of those explanations ever felt sufficient. They might explain individual cases, but they didn't explain the pattern. Why did one specific time period produce so many serial killers? All those supposed causal factors still exist today. Childhood abuse hasn't disappeared. Pornography is more accessible than ever. War veterans return home traumatized, yet the serial killer phenomenon has largely vanished. That's where the lead crime hypothesis enters, offering an explanation that's both simple and disturbing. The more lead you introduce into an environment, the more violent crime you'll eventually see. Lead is a neurotoxin, but not just any neurotoxin. It's particularly devastating to developing brains. When children are exposed to lead, even in doses that seem small, it fundamentally alters how their brains develop. It reduces IQ, it impairs impulse control, it increases aggressive tendencies, it damages the regions of the brain responsible for empathy and emotional regulation. Essentially, lead exposure creates individuals who are less intelligent, more prone to anger, and less capable of caring about others' suffering. That's not just a recipe for antisocial behavior. It's potentially a recipe for the kind of cold, remorseless violence that characterizes serial killers. Take that neurological cocktail and drop it into communities already struggling with poverty, systemic racism, mental health crises, and generational trauma, and you create conditions ripe for violence. The numbers tell a story that's hard to dismiss. In the United States, leaded gasoline was introduced in the 1920s, By the 1950s and 60s, it was ubiquitous. Urban air quality in major cities was appalling. Children played outside, rode bikes, and breathed microscopic poison every single day. Studies conducted decades later found that blood lead levels in American children during the 1960s were 5 times higher than today's levels. But here's where the data becomes genuinely eerie. Researcher Rick Nevin mapped historical lead exposure levels against violent crime rates and discovered a perfect 20-year lag. Lead exposure spikes in 1950, violent crime explodes in 1970. Lead exposure drops in 1980, violent crime plummets in 2000. This pattern repeated across multiple countries with remarkable consistency. The 20-year lag makes perfect sense when you consider that environmental exposure happens in childhood, but violent criminal behavior typically emerges in young adulthood. Now examine the birth years of America's most notorious serial killers. John Wayne Gacy, born 1942. Dennis Rader, BTK, 1945. Ted Bundy, 1946. Ed Kemper, 1948. Gary Ridgway, 1949. David Berkowitz, 1953. Richard Ramirez, 1960. Jeffrey Dahmer, 1960. Every single one was born between 1940 and 1960, the absolute peak of environmental lead contamination. But it's not just about when they were born, it's about where they grew up. These weren't children of privilege raised in suburban environments with minimal industrial pollution. They grew up in urban, poor, industrial neighborhoods where lead contamination was most severe. Ramirez grew up near chemical plants in El Paso. Berkowitz lived in a deteriorating Bronx apartment with peeling lead paint and ancient plumbing. Kemper's mother moved him constantly between rundown rental apartments. These environments weren't just emotionally toxic. They were literally poisoned with lead from paint, plumbing, and automotive exhaust that settled in the soil where children played. So why did serial killers largely disappear? By the 2000s, that wave of predators had faded dramatically. Yes, we still have killers, mass shootings, and terrorism. But the Bundy-type serial killer, the Gacy-style predator who hunts victims over years, they've largely vanished. Some people point to recent cases like the Long Island serial killer as evidence that serial killers still exist. But look at that suspect. Rex Heuermann, born 1963, right in the middle of the lead contamination peak. He's not evidence against the theory. He's potentially one of the last representatives of that lead poison generation. If the Dahmer or Gacy-style serial killer has become rare, what changed? The conventional explanations don't quite work. Maybe DNA evidence and surveillance cameras help catch killers faster before they can accumulate multiple victims. Maybe forensic improvements mean potential serial killers get arrested after their first murder. But maybe, just maybe, it's because we removed lead from gasoline, paint, and plumbing. We stopped poisoning children's developing brains, and 20 years later, violent crime dropped dramatically. Now, the obvious objection, plenty of people grew up with lead exposure and didn't become murderers. That's absolutely true. Just like not every person who experiences childhood trauma becomes violent. But we're not talking about guaranteed outcomes. We're discussing risk factors and tipping points. When someone's brain is already compromised by genetics, abuse, or neglect, lead exposure might be the additional factor that pushes them past a critical threshold. Humans are complicated. Violence emerges from multiple intersecting factors, not single causes. There's certainly no chemical formula that creates evil, but no other theory explains the timing as precisely as the lead crime hypothesis does. The correlation is too strong, too consistent across different countries and time periods to dismiss as mere coincidence. This doesn't mean Bundy or Gacy or Dahmer were victims who bear no responsibility for their actions. They made choices that destroyed countless lives. But maybe they were neurologically compromised before they ever had the opportunity to become something different. Maybe their brains were wired for destruction before they understood concepts like right and wrong. Lead didn't make the monsters. Personal choices did that. But lead exposure might have made it easier to ignore whatever conscience or empathy they possessed. It might have removed neurological barriers that keep most people from acting on dark impulses. The lead crime hypothesis doesn't excuse evil. It potentially explains why one particular generation produced so many individuals capable of sustained, remorseless violence. The implications are both hopeful and disturbing. Hopeful because it suggests we've already removed a major environmental factor that contributed to violence. Disturbing because it means we poisoned an entire generation of children and created conditions that may have helped produce some of history's worst predators.